every single Canadian across the whole history of the concept of Canada has been negatively impacted by the Indian Act, whether they know it or not. And that includes newcomers, that includes longstanding immigrant families, settlers, treaty, modern treaty, all of these definitions in terms of the Indigenous relationship. But to understand the regressive model of an extractive colonial economic relationship that we have through the Indian Act and its generational impact, that process of deconstruction is more aligned to creating economic space for Indigenous people so that Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, calls corporate Canada to the table to create meaningful partnerships and relationships. So I think that a constructive, demonstratable economic outcomes is reconciliation. And we're either doing that or we're not doing that.
Welcome to High Agency, igniting conversations with inspiring people, leading transformative change. Welcome to High Agency at Web Summit, where we're talking to founders, builders, and thinkers. I'm Mo Dhaliwal, and I'm here with Carol Anne Hilton, the founder of Indigenomics. Carol Anne, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And you're joining us from the Heshkwit Nation.
Yes.
Thank you so much for taking time during such a busy period. I've got to say, it's actually quite an honor to be sitting here talking to you because I feel like you've made such a cultural impact with an interesting perspective and an invention. The term Indigenomics I've heard used, I think, quite casually now in discourse in talking about First Nations relationship to crown, business, capitalism, community. But it's something that you coined in a hashtag, like in, I think it's been like over a decade or something, like a long time ago. What was it that actually, I think, inspired the original, tweet, message, whatever you put out in the hashtag? And what were you thinking when you thought of the term Indigenomics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always had an interest in Indigenous business and economy. And I had actually at the time been quite hesitant to be joining any social media, but I'd heard about this thing called Twitter and that you could create communities of threads of conversation. So that was really how it was formed, was my interest in Indigenous economy. And the formation of the word from nonsensical into an entire movement has been absolutely powerful. And to see the normalization of it in Canadian narrative is absolutely amazing.
Mm-hmm. But what led to that point? Like early on, what were your influences? What were your experiences? What led to that point where you decided at that point that you were going to spend your time, your life into creating this movement, into sharing this perspective?
Honestly, I finished my master's in business and I had made the decision while I was in the program that I would work for myself, and I always have, and set up my own company. And my interest areas were business and economics, of course. And I asked, well, how am I going to do this? And 21 years later, to look at building the concept of a technological language that connects through the hashtag is so elementary. It was kind of newfangled at the time in terms of the ability of a hashtag to do that. And I didn't necessarily know that I would be building a national and global movement. But that inspiration of Indigenous peoples have a lot to contribute in terms of our worldview of business and economy, and just the invisibility of that and the insufficiency around our data, and just overall the valuing our participation and perspective regionally and nationally. I set out to change that and make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Would you mind kind of unpacking like Indigenomics? I mean, like I understand, I'd say the TLDR would be that it's like a transformative approach to like economic reconciliation, infused with a First Nations worldview. But there's obviously a relationship with, capitalism, right? What does it mean to have a economic perspective when you're in a colonial state? And how do you sort of navigate and negotiate that? So I'd love for you to just kind of unpack Indigenomics in, 20 minutes that we have here together.
No, that's a great question. I think that, looking at it as the concept of economics from an Indigenous worldview, we're primarily only ever looking through one worldview of what economy is, and we are told that's what economy is, whereas our experience as Indigenous people was much more relational, much more accountable, much more generational. And to describe economy from that perspective, that also included a very strong ceremonial foundation to what economy is. And all of Western constructs of what economics is and GDP have nothing to do with time in terms of our place, our responsibility, generational responsibility, long term thinking. And I describe Indigenomics as modern Indigenous economic design. So it's bringing our modernity into visibility today and being able to address the myths of, seeing Indigenous peoples only in the past. It's about bringing the understanding of the legal relationship that what happens as Indigenous people advance our legal context, it happens in the courtroom, but it expresses itself in the economy. And that's a lot of how I frame the Indigenous relationship today is we're powerful economic players and we're economic powerhouses and have a rightful place at the economic table of this country.
Hmm. And I mean, it's been wonderful to witness, because like my relationship with colonialism is obviously fraught, right? From the Punjabi community. So we had our own very, violent relationship with the crown and what happened over the course of centuries. But then as a, settler on these lands of having a relationship to this place, some affinity with the understanding of what struggle is with the loss of language and culture and especially oppression. Um, you know, I wonder in the time that you've been kind of leading this movement and been a voice for Indigenomics, have you seen real movement and real change? Because, call me a cynic, but sometimes I worry that, especially when it comes to government, bureaucracies, and even in culture and community, that sometimes reconciliation is seen as a symbolic thing, as opposed to actually embodying the healing and restitution and the equity required, right? So you've worked with the Canadian finance minister, you've advised the BC economy. In these relationships and in these rooms, however much you can divulge, like, has it been real? Like, are you seeing movement?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important question. And what I see is a process of truth telling and being in the presence of our own leadership and our response as a region, as a country, that our ability to understand the role of the Indian Act in the shaping of Canada, which still exists today, and that the reference to Indigenous people in the historical context, what I refer to that is Indian Act economics, and that we have two forms of economy shaping this country simultaneously. And we are only paying attention to the mainstream economy, but essentially, this concept of Indian Act economics, every single Canadian across the whole history of the concept of Canada has been negatively impacted by the Indian Act, whether they know it or not. And that includes newcomers, that includes longstanding immigrant families, settlers, treaty, modern treaty, all of these definitions in terms of the Indigenous relationship. But to understand the regressive model of an extractive colonial economic relationship that we have through the Indian Act and its generational impact, that process of deconstruction is more aligned to creating economic space for Indigenous people so that Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, calls corporate Canada to the table to create meaningful partnerships and relationships. So I think that the constructive, demonstratable economic outcomes is reconciliation. And we're either doing that or we're not doing that. And while there's a social and cultural implication of reconciliation, I focus primarily on the economic component and the ability to measure that, the ability to refer to economic value is something that I'm really interested in.
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's something really sage in that approach because I feel like it's pretty easy to test the authenticity of, frankly, anyone's value system when you attach economics to it, right? Sadly, we all grew up in capitalism, and this is, the dominant power structures that we have and the dominant, forces at play. But yeah, if as they say, if somebody can put their money where their mouth is, it kind of makes it real, right? Because without that, yeah, it is words. It's a lot of symbolism. You said something interesting there about how everybody's been affected by the Indian Act, whether they know it or not. Okay, that's fascinating. Okay, can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you talk to companies that are working with Indigenous communities today, there's a pace of business that's unacceptable. There's a hierarchical, I have a hard time saying that word, um, relationship of um, the Minister of Indigenous Services that creates the conditions for, yes, the gates to open in terms of an economic development project. And the backlog and insufficiency in terms of time, the inefficiency in terms of resources, and the inefficiencies in terms of building the rate of economic pace that is happening, that is Indian Act economics. And to realize that the structures of the Indigenous economy that are productive and generative have to keep pace, that in itself is outgrowing the function of the Indian Act. So I suggest the Indian Act in itself, while it within it is the absence of the function of economy, was the purpose of it. Every single day that goes by with the rise of the Indigenous economy, the Indian Act becomes less and less relevant.
Incredible. Um, so, I mean, now I'm going to take all of what you shared and put that in the context of a technology and culture conference. Um, and, I imagine that, we've seen the impacts of this everywhere, but as technology continues exploding, as this AI tsunami washes over us, that we've seen a lot of opportunity getting created. We've seen a lot of things get accelerated for sure, but we've also seen massive amplification of bias, massive amplification of, systemic inequities that existed before. So what's your message at Web Summit? Like, what brings you here? And what's your experience been?
Yeah, absolutely. I am on a panel tomorrow called Indigenous Wisdom in Modern Technology. I'll be presenting on our work around the development of Indigenomics AI. It's an Indigenous economic intelligence engine that we're looking at mapping Indigenous economic activity and value. And to address the construct of Indian Act economics, the in itself is embedded the data inefficiency to actually value the Indigenous economic relationship. That is the bias built into the Indian Act. So to look at essentially this concept that if AI systems to address the bias of how they're built, to build an Indigenous economic data intelligence system, we are the bias as Indigenous people. And to address that head on in terms of a strength based narrative of Indigenous economic power is an alternative to the expectation of the original Indian Act, which denied our continued existence as people. So if that was the intent of the Indian Act was our elimination, the data is biased in the sense of our ability to create a constructive economy just by the structure itself. And of course, while we have many nations that are outside of that or who have self definition, the ability to build and bring a data set that talks about economic value and how that value is happening in terms of, land base, infrastructure development, on reserve or urban reserve, sorry, trusts, all of these tools and leverage points of value creation in the Indigenous economy. My work with Indigenomics AI talks about bringing the data that allows insight and foresight to how is Indigenous economic value expressed, what does that mean, and how is that deployed within the larger market of the Canadian economy.
What's the have you had much interaction with like the global audiences that are in attendance? Like,
I haven't had time.
no. Well, we'll have to check back with you afterwards, because part and parcel with that erasure, um, and that sort of the missing voice, that missing perspective that you're describing, is like Canada's brand to the rest of the world, which is kind of frustrating at times, right? Because it's seen as just this nation, it's mountains and nature and all of that. Um,
Beggars.
yeah, right. And but I think the understanding of the knowledge that there's many Indigenous nations here, or that there's these thriving cultures and many economies that existed and cultures that continue to exist, that's kind of missing from the brand of Canada for the most part, right? And so I'm really curious to see, I guess tomorrow now at the panel, to have conversation afterwards and actually just, see from a global perspective how attendees are feeding back on what you share and what their understanding is of, the Indigenous participation in events like this. Um, what are you excited by right now? Like whether it's with Indigenomics or what technology is enabling, as you look out into the world, what is seeming exciting to you? What's filling you with hope and opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. As an Indigenous person, I feel that this is a powerful moment that we're in of, the last residential school closed here in Canada in like the early 90s. Indigenous people could only get legal representation since the mid 60s. That the economic power that's represented in the evolution of the Indigenous relationship today, to actually understand that in a rapidly globalizing world, Canada's current mandate in terms of a strong economy as a primarily resource-based economy, all of those resources go through Indigenous lands. And Indigenous peoples are extremely well situated in terms of a consent-based agenda, a collaborative-based agenda, and early investment. And the Indigenous relationship should be viewed here as a strategic opportunity than a risk. And I think that to understand from the technology perspective, the financial architecture perspective, that should be a very resounding message of this is a place to do business, that Indigenous people are at the economic table.
Hmm. The the concern, especially when you're talking about where Indigenous peoples are really well situated to actually be at the table and negotiating for themselves and building those economies. There's still a fair amount of tone deafness. I think you would agree across the country, various levels of government. The latest, and I have to ask about this, but the Alberta, independence movement of somehow separating from Canada. There was a letter that actually was sent around by I think it was a number of different chiefs of different nations, basically saying that this is treaty territory and you're not able to actually make any claims like this without speaking with us, without bringing us to the table first. What other challenges are you seeing in these sorts of perspectives? Because on the one hand, there's this economic opportunity and engagement getting created, but on the other hand, you still have premiers like in Alberta that are coming out with, obviously a very, very locked in idea of what that province is and what they're capable of. But where else are you seeing challenges like that where work needs to be done?
Um, I think that the Alberta separatist agenda fails to realize that the land is entirely attached to the Indigenous relationship long before Canada was Canada, that the evolution of that, in terms of the treaties, that if it was to separate as its individual entity, it would be without land. So Alberta as a country,
Maybe a couple of streets in
be
Calgary.
a digital
Yeah.
country. And then if Alberta was to become part of the US, it would really be 50.5 because, again, it would be a digital state because it doesn't have the land attached to it.
Yeah. No, fair enough. That's a pretty, I think, sobering message. We'll have to.
50.5.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Um, you know, for Indigenomics and this movement, if you were to look out into the future and see a fully realized version of this vision, what does Indigenomics look like? What does Canada look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Our work on the global front, well, let's pull back. The $100 billion Indigenous economic agenda that Indigenomics is leading is already realized that we're operating within a $100 billion economic target, and the activation of partnership and investment, the demonstration of economic value, I think that we're demonstrating that is undervalued within a GDP metric and underestimated, I think, is significant to realize the uprise of Indigenous rights and the isolation of those rights from economic function. Part of what we're doing on the international level is we have Indigenomics Now. It's a 24-hour online conference that is having the conversation around examining the language model of Indigenous business, Indigenous sustainability, Indigenous worldview, and having the conversation of what a Indigenous World Economic Forum needs to be. Like the end vision is a multi-generational um, investment vehicle that looks at that Indigenomics principle of life at the center. So our ability to facilitate that as financial architecture and a technology platform brings ancient and modern together and takes accountability for our future.
What surprised you on the journey so far? Is there a situation or something that you encountered that was surprising, or something that you learned that you just weren't expecting?
I feel that on my first book, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, I published it at the end of the pandemic, so I didn't actually see it kind of take feet and do what it did. But to hear of how much it was studied in law school, business school, policy, governance, um, it's amazing to just see how many people are aware of this concept of Indigenomics and recentering in a strength-based narrative. So to see the empowering effect of it is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, that's incredible. Um, if somebody was going to set out on a mission tomorrow and want to create some sort of social change initiative, and tie it so deftly to economic restructuring the way you have, what advice would you give? I mean, I'm sure parts of it were a slog for sure. So what advice would you give to somebody that's trying to create that sort of social change through economic change?
I think to address our assumptions first, the lens that we're looking through. So I think the lens of what we look at as a problem, the lens that we look of who has experiences that as a problem, and the lens of who brings a voice to that, how technology can activate a positive outcome, I think is a power moment that we're in.
Hmm. Well, Carol Anne, thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Sure.
Much appreciated. And yeah, good luck on the panel tomorrow.
Thank you.
Well, hopefully we've given you a lot to think about. That was High Agency. Like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.